There is no way to go through this life without loss. But man, has that loss felt accelerated over the last 2.5 years. Some of these losses we can easily name: the loss of a loved one to COVID or other causes, for example, the losses Bill shared that he experienced in his life. And there are many other losses we've grieved and are still grieving that may feel harder to put our thumbs on or less conventional, and therefore may be harder to acknowledge in our lives and in the lives of others. We've lost time with our loved ones, and we grieve the time we won't get back. I have this vibrant, incredible goddaughter who was born in July of 2020, and I will never have the chance to hold her as a baby. We've lost milestones, and we've mourned the way we plan to celebrate that birthday, graduation, anniversary, wedding, birth, prom, new home, retirement, holiday, all of the things. We've lost jobs, and with them, perhaps our sense of purpose or a key aspect of our identity. We lost a sense of security, predictability, control. Maybe that was all an illusion to begin with, but we grieved it nonetheless. Beyond the losses that feel very specific to the pandemic times, the world kept on spinning, and we experienced the inevitable losses that come with living life. Friends, family members, and community members have passed away. We've struggled through health diagnoses and endured treatment. We've ended relationships. Friendships have faded or changed. In addition to that visceral experience of losing a person in the present moment, we've grieved the loss of the future we imagined with them. We've grieved the relationships we wish we could have with people who are still here with us, but with whom we know that having that connection would prevent us from living our healthiest, truest, safest selves. The grief we've experienced in our individual lives has all occurred against the backdrop of multi-layered collective grief. We grieve for a world filled with racism, hatred, violence, transphobia, and so much more. None of this is new, but many of us have grappled with it and our own role in it in new ways over the last few years. We grieve for our planet as we continue to learn more and more about the devastating and irreversible changes our species has set into motion. And we are now actively grieving the loss of bodily autonomy for people who can become pregnant, with the recognition that Black and brown folks have long and repeatedly been denied their rights to make decisions about their bodies. I read somewhere that there's a German word for this, Weltschmerz, roughly translated to world pain, the grief that we feel at the state of the world and our wish that things were different. At a time when we needed one another's support, we were isolated, and our capacity for community care felt diminished as everyone's individual emotional resources were depleted by managing their own day-to-day experiences and losses. It is a lot to hold, and I don't think any of us are giving ourselves credit for all that we've held and all that we continue to hold. So I'll just invite everybody to take a deep breath. I just named a lot. We're holding that all in this space, so just So before I get further in, I want to share a few disclaimers. While I felt called to share about this topic, I also feel grossly inadequate. I even said to Reverend Christine, "Who am I to talk about grief? I haven't experienced the loss of a child, a parent, a spouse." She simply replied, "Who are you not to?" I think that's part of our problem. All of our grief matters. Our grief over our capital L losses and our lowercase l losses. They aren't the same, and I can't pretend to know what it feels like to carry the experiences that each of you carries. But ignoring or downplaying my own grief doesn't make yours any less painful. Second disclaimer, I am not here to offer a solution or put a silver lining spin on this. Much as I've wished as I've navigated my own losses, there is no checklist, there's no right way of doing this. I'm not a professional grief counselor. I am here as a human, humaning with all of you, getting it wrong, trying again, and giving myself these reminders as much as anyone else. In March 2020, that very first month when all of our lives shifted so dramatically, an article from the Harvard Business Review went viral. It was called, "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." At the time, I forwarded it to several family members and friends, as it really helped me to have the language to describe what I was experiencing. The author interviews David Kessler, a grief expert, who shares, quote, "There is something powerful about naming these pandemic experiences as grief. When you name it, you feel it, and it moves through you. Emotions need motion. I feel sad. Let me go feel sad for 5 minutes," end quote. One thing that's helped me in naming and feeling my grief is to recognize what it symbolizes for me. About 6 months into the pandemic, I had a significant loss in my life when my former partner and I ended our relationship. Sometime shortly after that, I read a quote from psychologist Susan David, "Grief is love looking for a home." It was the first time I made that connection between grief and love, and it struck me like a lightning bolt. Of course, these two are so deeply connected. Grief advocate Marissa Renee Lee put it even more simply in the title of her recent book, "Grief is Love." Grief is love. Being able to name what I was experiencing as grief and remind myself that the depth of my grief reflected the depth of my love didn't make my experience any easier, but it did give me some further language to describe what I was feeling and why. As someone who has always prided myself on being a good student, it's been hard for me to accept that there's no way to do grief, quote unquote, right. I wanted my therapist to give me a 5-step plan. I expected to feel incrementally better over time and always on a positive trajectory. Most of all, I wanted to fit grief into my schedule in a way that I could keep everything else moving, wrestle with it, and then emerge on the other side, tell myself that I would feel better in X number of months. Spoiler alert, grief doesn't work like that. I love this quote from author Elizabeth Gilbert that's so fitting with our theme. She says, "Grief does not obey your plans or your wishes. Grief will do whatever it wants to you, whenever it wants to. In that regard, grief has a lot in common with love," end quote. We can't control love, and we certainly can't control our grief. Now here's where some of you might be thinking, wait, there is a roadmap to grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. You might have heard of them: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. It turns out there are a few important caveats to keep in mind when you're thinking about these stages and how they might map onto your experience. First, they are not meant to be linear. You don't move cleanly from one stage to the next and then reach that ultimate state of healing. They come in all different orders, and it's incredibly common to cycle in and out of them, sometimes in the span of a few minutes. Second, and I didn't learn this until recently, these stages were initially identified for the person who was dying, not their loved ones left behind. Someone who knows they're nearing the end of their life might move through these 5 different stages, but not necessarily their loved ones who are mourning them after their death. I personally still find them to be useful, but it's one of those reminders to take what's useful to you and leave the rest. As for the timeline, it turns out that grief is for a lifetime. Thankfully, however, this doesn't mean that we'll be in our deepest sadness or our ragiest anger forever. What it does mean is that we will more acutely feel the both and of life. We can be deep in our grief and still capable of experiencing pure joy. We can be many years out from our loss and feel it anew and differently, especially in those joyful moments we desperately want to share with someone we're missing. Grief and love and grief and joy are so interconnected. So this is not the point where I talk about the silver lining of these impossibly challenging circumstances we've all been navigating. It is, however, when I remind us that we hold incredible capacity, more than we realize, to grow around these experiences of loss while still being forever changed by them. This is one of the images of grief that we'll share here in a moment that I found most helpful, and I offer it today in case it resonates with anyone else. So you might be able to read that. It says, "People tend to believe that grief shrinks over time, but what really happens is that we grow around our grief." There are a few things I find particularly helpful about this. First, if your grief doesn't feel like it's getting smaller over time, that's okay, and dare I say normal. It's not about getting over the loss, but making space for it. Second, what changes is our capacity to carry that grief and to integrate it into our lives. We expand and grow around it, and as we do, we might feel ourselves carrying that loss a little differently. Like the lobster in our Together Time story, we will cycle through periods of intense discomfort, a sign that we're growing. We will hunker down to protect our tender selves while our new shells are forming, and we will reemerge in our new shapes. It's not a one and done. We will do this repeatedly over the course of our lives as we navigate many seasons of change and loss. And what do we do with our Weltschmerz, our grief over the state of the world? I'm reminded of the quote in our beloved minister's email signature from Dr. Cornel West. "Never forget that justice is what love looks like in public." The grief we're feeling is a sign of our deep love for each other, for our communities, for our planet, and for ourselves. The grief and love both compel us to act, to live our love out loud. The grief is telling us to do something, and we can honor by listening and turning it into action, and caring for ourselves in a way that sustains us through this hard and necessary work. Which brings me to my final reflection on grief this morning. We heal in and through our relationships with ourselves and with each other. As I grieved the loss of my relationship while simultaneously grieving all that the pandemic seemed to have stripped from me, I leaned into my community, both here at UUCP and amongst family and close friends. It's hard for me to ask for support, and also very hard for many folks to know how to show up for someone who's experienced a loss. But I truly believe it is the love that was poured into me from so many different places that helped to sustain me through this time. The unexpected care package that showed up several months after my loss, my best friend who listened to me verbally process my experience on constant repeat, my sister who still asks me how I'm doing and recognizes that this grief will always be a part of me. Just like there's no right way to grieve, there is no right way to show up for a loved one who's going through a difficult time. Sometimes we get so uncomfortable around other people's discomfort that we don't do anything at all. We have to accept that we won't do it perfectly and still find ways to show up that are authentic to us and to our relationship with the person who's grieving. So where does that leave us if I'm not going to offer the magic formula for healing? We name it. We acknowledge grief in ourselves and in others. We honor the love that is inextricably tied to the grief. Grief would not exist without that love. And we choose love again and again and again. We give ourselves and each other grace and compassion especially ourselves. We abandon the expectation that we will come out on the other side. There is no other side. We're in it now. Our capacity to carry our grief will grow and change, but all that we've experienced remains a part of us forever. In fact, we may even find that it becomes part of our superpower, a well of empathy we can draw on as we work to support those around us, and a source of strength as we work to build a more just world. We lean on each other and take turns and share of ourselves when we're able to. We recognize when we have the capacity to give, and we accept the support when we need it. We hold on to the words from our meditation prayer today and marvel at how our hearts can keep on beating despite all we've experienced. And we know that the only cure for love is more of it. May it be so.